We begin on a cold morning in October, in the year 1307. All across France, before the sun is even up, the king's soldiers are on the move. Every one of them is carrying a sealed letter, and they were all told to open those letters at the exact same hour, so that nobody could get warned ahead of time. They ride up to houses, to castles, to quiet little farms run by men in white cloaks, and they start breaking down doors. By the time the sun goes down, thousands of those men are in chains. And here's the thing, these men weren't bandits. They weren't rebels or criminals. They were monks, warrior monks actually, the most respected and most feared fighting force in the whole Christian world. They had their own banks. They owned land in just about every country in Europe. They answered to no king, only to the Pope himself. And in a single morning, the King of France set out to wipe them off the face of the earth. So how does that even happen? How do you go from holy heroes that kings line up to borrow money from, to prisoners being tortured in a dungeon on charges of spitting on the cross? That's the story I want to walk you through. The whole thing, start to finish. And the start is a lot smaller, and honestly, a lot stranger than you'd expect. So let's go back, almost 200 years before that October morning. To understand the Templars, you have to understand the world they were born into. And that world was obsessed with one city, Jerusalem. For Christians in Europe, it was the holiest place on earth, the city where Jesus died. But for hundreds of years, it had been under Muslim rule, and getting there meant a long, dangerous trip across land that didn't belong to you. Then, in the year 1099, that changed. An army of European knights had marched all the way across the world on what we now call the First Crusade, and after a brutal siege, they took Jerusalem by force. The slaughter, when they took it, was horrific, and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. But for Europe, the result was a shock of joy. The holy city was in Christian hands. They set up a little cluster of crusader kingdoms along the coast, and suddenly the gates were open. So the pilgrims came, thousands of ordinary Christians, packing up everything they had to go walk where Jesus walked. The problem was, taking the city was one thing, holding the roads was another. Once a pilgrim stepped off the boat and started heading inland, they were on their own. The roads were crawling with bandits, and the Crusader kingdom was a thin strip of land surrounded by enemies. People got robbed. People got killed. We're told that on one bad stretch, hundreds of pilgrims were massacred at once. The Holy Land was open for visiting, but it was nowhere near safe. And this is where our story really starts. Around the year 1119, a knight from the region of Champagne, in France, a man named Hugues de Payens, looked at all this and had an idea. He gathered a small group of fellow knights, and together they went before the king of Jerusalem and the church leaders there, and they made a vow. They would give up everything, money, comfort, family, all of it, and they'd live like monks. But instead of hiding away in a monastery praying all day, they'd carry swords. Their whole job, their holy mission, would be to guard the pilgrims on those deadly roads. Now, the old story says there were just 9 of them, and that they took no new members for 9 years. I take that with a grain of salt. It's a neat little number, and neat little numbers in old stories are often too neat to be fully true. We honestly don't know the exact count, but the basic idea is solid. It started tiny. a handful of broke knights doing security work for travelers for free in the name of God. The king of Jerusalem liked these men, and he gave them somewhere to stay. He gave them a wing of his palace, which sat on top of a hill that everyone believed was the site of the ancient Temple of Solomon, the great temple from the Bible. And that's where the name comes from. These knights became the Knights of the Temple, the Templars. Their full official name was a mouthful: the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. And in the beginning, that word poor was the truth. They were so broke that their official symbol, the image they'd be known by, was two knights riding on a single horse. Two men, one horse. The idea was, look how humble we are. We can't even afford a horse each. Hold on to that image, by the way. Two poor knights sharing a horse. Because where this ends up is about as far from that as you can possibly get. For the first several years, they were small and they struggled. A few good men doing hard, unglamorous work. They might have stayed that way and been forgotten by history completely. But then they got something that changed everything. They got a celebrity endorsement. There was a man in France named Bernard of Clairvaux, and in the religious world of that time, Bernard was about as famous and powerful as a person could be. He was a monk, a writer, an advisor to popes and kings, the kind of man whose opinion could move an entire continent. And for reasons that were partly family connection and partly true belief, Bernard decided to champion these strange new warrior monks. In the year 1129, the church held a big meeting in the town of Troyes in France. And there, with Bernard pushing hard for them, the church officially recognized the Templars and gave them a formal rule to live by, a kind of rule book for how they were supposed to act. It laid out everything: how they should pray, what they could eat, what they had to wear. They got their famous look around this time too: white robes, and later a bold red cross stitched on, the white for purity and the red for the blood they were willing to spill. Then Bernard went further. He sat down and wrote a whole letter, almost a little book, praising them. He basically argued that these men were a new kind of holy warrior, that killing an enemy of Christ in battle wasn't a sin for them. It was a good deed. Now, you can think whatever you want about that idea, and plenty of people then and now find it pretty dark. But coming from the most respected religious voice in Europe, it was rocket fuel. Suddenly, the Templars weren't a weird little band of broke knights. They were the hottest holy cause on the continent, and the donations came pouring in. This is the part that's hard to wrap your head around. Wealthy families all over Europe started giving the Templars gifts, not just coins, land, farms, whole villages, castles, mills. People would join the order and hand over everything they owned. Others would give a chunk of their estate just to get the blessing of being connected to these holy fighters. And because the Templars were monks who'd sworn to own nothing as individuals, all of it flowed into the order itself, which kept growing and growing. Then, in the year 1139, came the move that really set them apart. The Pope issued an official order that put the Templars in a class of their own. From now on, the Templars answered to nobody but the Pope himself. No king could tell them what to do. No local bishop had authority over them. They didn't have to pay taxes. They could keep whatever they won in battle. They could build their own churches and have their own priests. Think about what that means. In a world made up of kingdoms with hard borders, here was this one organization that floated above all of it, loyal only to the Pope, untouchable by the kings whose land they lived on. There had never really been anything like it. So, now you've got an organization that's spread across every country in Europe, that owns enormous amounts of land, that answers to no local ruler, and that's run by disciplined men who don't drink themselves stupid or gamble away the funds because they're monks. And that combination led them, almost by accident, into the business they'd become legendary for. Banking. Here's the problem they solved. Say you're a rich lord and you want to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem or fight in a crusade. That's a journey of months, across thousands of miles. You need money for the whole trip. But if you carry a chest of gold the whole way, you're basically a walking target. Every bandit between France and Jerusalem wants that chest. The Templars had an answer. You could walk into a Templar building in, say, Paris, and hand them your gold. They'd write you out a letter, a kind of receipt, noting how much you deposited. Then you travel light, with no treasure to steal, all the way to the Holy Land. And when you got there, you'd walk into the Templar building in Jerusalem, show them your letter, and they'd give you your money back. Different building, different country, same money. You see what that is, right? That's a checking account. That's wiring money. They built one of the first versions of international banking the West had ever seen, and they built it on something nobody else had. A trusted network of their own buildings, stretching all the way across the known world. And once you can move money safely, all kinds of other business follows. The Templars started lending money. They held valuables for safekeeping. They managed estates. Before long, they were the bankers to the powerful. They handled money for kings. The French royal treasury, the actual national treasury of France, was kept in the Paris Temple and managed by Templars for a stretch. Kings borrowed from them. The Pope borrowed from them. They got so good at handling money that rulers trusted them with the crown jewels. Stop and think about that turn for a second. The order that started with two men sharing one horse, the order whose whole brand was being poor, was now one of the richest single organizations in the world. They never forgot the white robes and the prayers, but they were now running an empire of money. And that, more than anything else, is the seed of how it all ends. Hold that thought. At the very same time, the other half of who they were just kept getting stronger, and that was the fighting. On the battlefield, the Templars became something genuinely fearsome, while other knights fought for glory and riches, and might run when things got ugly. The Templars had rules. They weren't allowed to retreat unless the enemy outnumbered them more than 3-1. They weren't allowed to be ransomed, which in those days was a big deal, because a captured noble would usually just buy his way free. A captured Templar couldn't do that. The order wouldn't pay. So an enemy who took a Templar prisoner often just executed him, and the Templars knew that going in. It made them terrifying. These were men who would not break and would not run, charging straight at you, because dying in that fight was, to them, a one-way ticket to heaven. For decades, they were the backbone of the Christian armies in the Holy Land. They held castles, they guarded the borders. When a Crusader army marched, the Templars were often the tip of the spear and the rear guard covering the retreat. They won battles they had no business winning. They were, for a long time, the closest thing that world had to special forces. But the Holy Land was always a hard place to hold, and the tide was turning. On the Muslim side, a brilliant leader had risen up and united the forces against the Crusaders. His name was Saladin, and even his enemies came to respect him. And in the year 1187, Saladin lured the Crusader army into a trap that would become one of the worst days in the whole history of the Crusader kingdoms. It happened at a spot with two hills called the Horns of Hattin. The Crusaders and the Templars among them made a terrible decision. They marched their whole army across dry, open country in the brutal summer heat to go relieve a town under siege. By the time they got close, they were dying of thirst, exhausted, and surrounded. Saladin's men set fire to the dry brush, so the smoke choked them. And then they cut the Crusader army to pieces. It was a catastrophe. Saladin took thousands of prisoners that day, and he made a particular decision about the Templars and their close cousins, another warrior order called the Hospitallers. He saw these holy knights as the most fanatical, most dangerous enemies he had, the ones who would never stop and never make peace. So he had them executed, around 200 of them killed on his orders. He spared common soldiers and held nobles for ransom, but the warrior monks he wiped out. He understood exactly what they were. After Hattin, the whole Crusader kingdom came apart. Jerusalem itself, the holy city, the entire reason the Templars existed, fell to Saladin that same year. The Christians clung on to a few cities on the coast, and for another 100 years they fought to hold what little was left. The Templars fought right alongside everyone else through all of it. But slowly, year by year, the Crusaders lost ground, and then came the end of the road in the Holy Land. The year was 1291. The last major Christian stronghold was a great port city called Acre. A massive Muslim army, the Mamluks, came and laid siege to it. The Templars and the other defenders fought desperately. The Grand Master of the Templars, the head of the whole order, was killed in the fighting. And in the end, the walls broke and Acre fell. The survivors fled by sea. Now, I want you to really sit with what just happened to the Templars here, because it's the quiet beginning of their downfall, and it's easy to miss. The Templars existed for one reason: to protect Christians and Christian land in the Holy Land. That was the entire point of them, written right into their name and their vows. And now the Holy Land was gone, every last bit of it. The pilgrims they were founded to guard had nowhere to go. The kingdom they were founded to defend didn't exist anymore. So picture where they stood. They were still unbelievably rich. They still owned land and castles all over Europe. They were still answerable to nobody but the Pope. But the job was gone. They were the most powerful order in the Christian world, and they no longer had a reason to exist. They pulled back to the island of Cyprus and to their estates across Europe, and they sort of looked around for what to do next. That's a dangerous spot to be in. A huge, rich, armed, untouchable organization with no clear purpose anymore, and a whole lot of land and money that other people would love to get their hands on. And there was one man in particular looking at all that Templar wealth with very interested eyes. His name was Philip IV, the King of France. People called him Philip the Fair, which referred to his good looks, not his sense of justice. And Philip had a problem that kings have always had. He was broke. France had been at war, and wars are expensive, and Philip had already done some pretty ruthless things to find cash. He'd squeezed the church. He'd gone after the bankers from Italy. He'd even rounded up the Jewish population of France, thrown them out, and seized their property. The man had a habit. When he needed money, he found a wealthy group that couldn't fight back, and he took what they had. And here were the Templars, sitting on a fortune with their main job gone, and, importantly, Philip personally owed them a lot of money, because, like everyone else, he'd borrowed from them. Now, you can't just rob the Pope's own holy warriors. They're protected. They're heroes. So Philip needed a reason. He needed to make them look like monsters. And here's where the story gets dark. And honestly, kind of sickening. On Friday, the 13th of October, in the year 1307, Philip sprang his trap. Those sealed orders I described at the very start, the soldiers opening them all at the same hour, that was this. In one coordinated swoop, the king's men arrested the Templars all across France, hundreds of them. The Grand Master himself, an older man named Jacques de Molay, was taken. By the way, this is one of the popular explanations people give for why Friday the 13th is considered unlucky. I'd be careful with that one. The unlucky Friday the 13th idea doesn't clearly show up in the records until centuries later, so I wouldn't bet money that the Templars are really where the superstition comes from. But the arrests on that exact day, those are absolutely real. So now, Philip has hundreds of Templars in his dungeons, and he needs them to confess to terrible things, to justify what he's doing. So he tortures them. And medieval torture was about as horrifying as you're imagining. They were starved, kept in chains, and worse. We know that some men had the soles of their feet held to a fire until the bones fell out. Under that kind of pain, people will say absolutely anything to make it stop, and they did. The charges were wild. The Templars were accused of denying Christ and spitting on the cross during secret initiation ceremonies. They were accused of worshipping an idol, a mysterious head sometimes called Baphomet. They were accused of all sorts of obscene acts done in secret. It was a grab bag of every scary, shocking thing you could pin on a secret society. And one by one, broken by torture, the Templars confessed. Even Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, confessed. Now, were any of the charges true? Almost certainly not. At least not the big scary ones. Historians have looked at this for centuries, and the strong view is that these were trumped up accusations, the kind of thing you could get anyone to confess to with enough pain. The confessions don't match up. They smell of the torture chamber, and the moment some of these men were brought somewhere safe and out from under the threat of fire, they took it all back and said they'd been forced. There's a real document, by the way, that historians dug up in the Vatican's own archives only about 20 years ago. It's called the Chinon Parchment, and it shows that the Pope's own investigators, after questioning the Templar leaders, actually found them not guilty of heresy and forgave them. The Pope privately knew the charges didn't hold up. So why didn't the Pope just save them? Because the Pope, a man named Clement V, was weak, and he was basically in Philip's pocket. The popes of this era were living in France, under heavy French influence, and Clement owed his position partly to Philip. He squirmed. He tried to take control of the trials himself, to slow things down. For a moment, it looked like he might protect the order, but Philip kept up the pressure, even threatening the Pope's own standing, and in the end, Clement folded. In the year 1312, at a big church council, the Pope officially shut the Templars down. And here's a detail that matters. He didn't actually declare them guilty. He couldn't, because the evidence wasn't there. Instead, He basically said the order's reputation was so damaged by all these accusations that it could no longer function, and so he was dissolving it. It's a coward's compromise, if you ask me. He didn't have the spine to clear them, and he didn't have the evidence to condemn them, so he just erased them and called it tidiness. After almost 200 years, the Knights Templar were finished, ended not by an enemy army, but by a stroke of the Pope's pen. Their lands and money were supposed to be handed over to the other big warrior order, the Hospitallers. A lot of it was, but a lot of it also stuck to the fingers of the kings who'd been holding the Templars prisoner, especially in France. Funny how that works. That left one last loose end: the leaders. Jacques de Molay, the old Grand Master, had spent years now in prison. He had confessed under torture, then taken it back, then gotten tangled up in the whole miserable process. And in the year 1314, he was brought out in public in Paris, expected to stand there and repeat his confession one final time so it could all be wrapped up neatly. But he didn't. In what was probably the bravest moment of his whole life, the old man stood up in front of the crowd and took it all back. He declared that the Templars were innocent, that the only crime he was guilty of was lying about his brothers to save his own skin under torture. He knew exactly what saying that would cost him. By taking back his confession, he was now a relapsed heretic in the eyes of the court, and the punishment for that was death by fire. That same evening, Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake on a small island in the river Seine, in the heart of Paris, along with another Templar leader who stood with him to the end. Witnesses say he died calmly and asked to be tied facing the Cathedral of Notre Dame, so he could look at it while he burned. And here's where history blends into legend. The story goes that from the flames, as he was dying, Jacques de Molay called out a curse. He's said to have summoned both the Pope and the King to meet him before God's court within the year, to answer for what they'd done. Now, I have to be honest with you. We can't be sure he actually said this. The dramatic curse shows up in some accounts and is missing from others. And it's exactly the kind of thing people love to add to a story afterward to make it feel like justice. So treat the curse itself as a legend. But here's what's not a legend, and is the part that gives me chills. Pope Clement, the man who dissolved the order, died about a month after de Molay burned. And King Philip, the man who engineered the whole thing, was dead before the end of that same year, the year 1314, after a fall while out hunting. Both of his accusers gone within months. And it didn't stop there. Philip had 3 sons, and over the next 14 years, all 3 of them took the throne, and all 3 of them died, one after another, without leaving a son to follow them. The ancient royal bloodline that had ruled France for over 300 years simply ran out, right there, in the span of a few years. Now, I am not telling you a dead man's curse killed a dynasty. Kings died young all the time. But you can absolutely understand why people at the time looked at all this, looked at how fast every single one of those men dropped, and whispered that the burned Grand Master had reached up out of the fire and pulled them all down with him. So that's the fall. That's the end of the Knights Templar as an order. But it's not quite the end of the story, because a thing this big doesn't just vanish without leaving ripples. In some countries, the rulers didn't really buy the charges and didn't want to destroy their own Templars. In Portugal especially, the king basically just gave the order a new name. He folded the Portuguese Templars, their members, their castles, their wealth, all of it into a fresh organization called the Order of Christ. Same men, new label. And here's a fun thread to pull. A couple of 100 years later, when Portugal sent its famous explorers out across the oceans to discover new worlds, the ships sailed under the red cross of that Order of Christ. The descendants of the Templars, in a way, helped fund the age of exploration. The order didn't really die in Portugal, it just changed clothes. And then there are the legends, which honestly may be the Templars' biggest legacy of all, because they ended in such a strange, dramatic, secretive way, drowned in rumors of hidden rituals and a mysterious idol and untold treasure. People have never stopped speculating about them. For 700 years, the Templars have been stuffed into every conspiracy theory you can imagine. People say they found the Holy Grail. People say they hid a vast treasure that's never been found. People link them to the Freemasons, to secret societies, to hidden bloodlines, to whatever new mystery is popular that decade. You'll find them in novels, in movies, in video games, always guarding some ancient secret, and I get why. The truth is, almost none of that mystical stuff holds up to a serious look. The real Templars were not wizards guarding a magic cup. But you can see how the legend grew, can't you? Take a secret brotherhood of holy warriors, make them unimaginably rich and powerful, have them answer to no one. Then have them get wiped out overnight on dark, whispered charges, with their leader cursing kings from a fire. Of course, people filled the silence with treasure and magic. The strange, sad, very human truth was never going to be enough for them. So let me leave you with the real shape of it. The Knights Templar started as a handful of poor knights, so broke they shared a horse, doing a simple, decent job, keeping travelers safe. They became the most powerful brotherhood in the Christian world. Holy warriors and history's bankers rolled into one. They held the line in the Holy Land for almost 2 centuries. And in the end, it wasn't an enemy sword that destroyed them. It was their own wealth and a desperate king who wanted it, and a pope too weak to stop him. They were brought down not because they were guilty, but because they were rich and in the way. 2 poor knights on 1 horse, all the way to death. That's the whole ride, and I think it's one of the best true stories we've got.